as we've seen throughout the past few years, the government and decades, the U.S. government using tactics involving the war on terrorism, the Patriot Act, to put out wide expansion of erosion of civil liberties, not just on the American people, not just regular citizens, but also journalists. Now, this story came out a few days ago, titled "U.S. Government Labeled Al Jazeera Journalists as Al Qaeda." The person involved was, apologies for if I may be butchering the name, Ahmed Mofak Zaidan, who's the Islamabad bureau chief with Al Jazeera. And documents from Edward Snowden that came out, the NSA whistleblower, from June 2012, from an NSA PowerPoint presentation, had his picture under him, and under him had member of Al Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, and works for Al Jazeera in quotations under his picture with his name. And this goes back to even further related to Al Jazeera and how they're targeted for simply having base in Qatar and the work that they do. Back in other cases involving Al Jazeera journalists, including this one, Sam Al-Haji, a cameraman who was imprisoned at Gitmo briefly for 6 years and released without charges in 2008, simply on suspicion of terrorism. Another case involving it is Tariq Ayoub was killed in U.S. bomb attacks during the invasion of Iraq. Now, it's no surprise also how the governments that are involved in these particular wars, not just in Iraq, but also Afghanistan and other places, where they specifically target journalists where they're covering the real story on the ground. Usually what happens is with journalists, they're embedded with different platoons or particular troops involved in the war so that they could get the prepackaged propaganda story, the government talking points involved in the generals on the ground, instead of the actual story that the generals or the people on the ground won't talk about unless you're out of that area, including the example would be the Green Zone, places like that. And the Fallujah correspondent, Ahmed Mansour, was targeted with tanks also during this time when he was on the ground covering the wars in Iraq and other places like that. So it really shows just how the tactics of the U.S. government, where they're that scared of journalism and the real story covering on the ground. We see great journalists, I definitely recommend following Jeremy Scahill, who reports that on the ground in several different conflicts overseas, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all those different places where they were covering the real story on the ground and not just getting fed the government talking points where you won't get the actual story. You'll just get the fed propaganda from them so that they could put it out to the establishment so that they could cover it and say, oh, look, we covered it. But in reality, they're not covering it. They're just regurgitating lies, as we've seen throughout the establishment and the establishment mainstream media. A perfect example of this is Amber Lyon, who I also had the chance to interview in November of 2013 about this, where she was covering on the ground in Bahrain, where she was targeted simply for putting out documentary information about the police in Bahrain was actually the dictatorship, the government funded and backed by the United States, and including weapons and supplies given to the police to suppress dissent, to suppress protesters in that area of the country, because they were protesting against the U.S. having carriers, warships in the Bahraini port, because the U.S. government funds them, so that was their little kickback to have a little base there, air base that obviously people would be legitimately concerned about, because there's a foreign country basically pretty much occupying a soft occupying of that particular country. So when she decided to come out about it, she got backlash, and the documentary about Bahrain, which would have been powerful in itself, the footage and would catch the government red-handed involving in Bahrain, the CNN footage ended up never being released. So she decided to speak out against that, and she was later reprimanded and fired for that, fired from her job as an investigative journalist at CNN for this particular story. You can check out that interview in the description below, and also in that link for you to click on to check that out. I highly recommend to follow her amazing work and amazing people like Jeremy Scahill, Amber Lyon, and so many others who really do the job of reporting what's really on the ground, what's really happening on the ground, because as much as the audience, you, the audience, know how important journalism, that particular type of journalism is, the adversarial journalism that is needed to basically buck the establishment narrative and really put out the real truth necessarily. The real bias is the truth. That's the bias that we have, is the truth, to report on the stories that really matter, regardless of the party line, regardless of the false left-right paradigm that everyone is put under because of this establishment mainstream media keeping the infighting going, keeping to divide us, to divide everyone from getting the real story out. So if you like this video, click the like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos coming soon. I'll be going to Washington, D.C. in a few days, so you can stay tuned on my Twitter at twitter.com/JeffWRCCT. You can also check out my Instagram, instagram.com/JeffWeareChangeCT, to check out all the pictures throughout my travels this week. I'll be in D.C. for some interviews and so much more, so stay tuned. You're really going to like these interviews coming soon from D.C. and our coverage, so stay tuned for pictures, videos, and much more coming soon.